The first time he said it, I thought I misheard. "This is Claire," he told the woman in sequins and pearls beside him. "She's just a teacher." He smiled as he said it, charming, effortless, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. My face didn't move. Not because I wasn't shocked, but because I'd learned how to freeze behind polite expressions. We were standing in the middle of the most glamorous room I had ever stepped into, chandeliers like starlight, glasses chiming with champagne, and tables marked with names that moved money behind closed doors. It was a gala to raise funds for underprivileged schools, something I'd spent years advocating for. And yet, in one breath, I'd been reduced to a job title spoken like an apology. Just a teacher. Not a partner. Not someone with vision, purpose, or identity beyond the classroom. He didn't look back to see how it landed. He was already turning toward the next person, shaking hands, playing the room. I stood there, glass in hand, nodding politely as someone asked if I taught finger painting or fractions. I smiled. Said, both. But inside, something cracked, not from pain, but from clarity. He didn't see me. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. And I realized then that when someone tries to make you smaller in a room you helped build, it's time to remind them exactly whose name belongs on the donation wall that I walked to. The edge of the ballroom, near the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, and let the sound of soft jazz and distant laughter blur into a single, numbing hum. Just a teacher. It repeated in my head like a knock that wouldn't stop. I thought about the nights I spent grading papers while he prepared investment decks. About how I donated quietly, in small amounts, to the very schools this event claimed to care about. I thought about the girls in my class who learned to speak louder because I taught them how. The boys who cried at their desks and didn't get punished for being human. The parents who hugged me at the end of the year like I had saved something in their home. But to him, in this room of money and power, none of that mattered. I wasn't impressive. I was convenient. Smart enough to keep, soft enough to overlook. A pleasant accessory to a successful man. I stared at my reflection in the glass, wondering how long I had tolerated being introduced like background noise. And suddenly, I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. I had spent years lifting voices that the world dismissed, and I had forgotten to lift my own. That night, I didn't walk out. I didn't argue. I simply picked up my phone, stepped into the hallway, and called someone who had always seen my value. My accountant. The call took less than 3 minutes. My accountant answered on the second ring, his voice calm and warm, like always. I told him the name of the foundation. I told him the amount, 100,000. And I told him how I wanted. It listed, under my maiden name, not his. "Are you sure?" he asked, not out of doubt, but respect. "Completely," I replied. Because in that moment, I wasn't donating to prove a point. I was donating to place a mirror on the wall, one that would reflect the truth back at everyone who had looked right through me. I walked back into the ballroom just in time for dessert. He was still laughing with donors, still introducing me with that same soft condescension. But I had already made my move. And the moment the MC stepped on stage to thank a surprise benefactor who had given generously to rebuild arts programs in inner-city schools, I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I simply lifted my glass and took a sip. My name echoed through the room, not the name he gave me, but the one I had carried before him. The one that reminded me who I was before I started editing myself to fit someone else's stage. He looked at me then, confused, surprised, maybe even impressed. But I didn't turn to meet his gaze. I kept my eyes on the spotlight, where I had never needed him to place me. I had found it on my own. The car ride home was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. He didn't ask me about the donation. Didn't mention the announcement. He just sat there beside me, staring out the window like the city might answer the questions he was too proud to ask. I watched his reflection in the glass, jaw tight, fingers tapping his knee, and I knew he was trying to make sense of it all without having to admit he'd missed something important. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered how many times I'd sat quietly beside him while he took the spotlight, never once offering to share it. How often I'd been introduced as supportive, kind, or someone who really understands his schedule, like I was a perfectly tailored accessory, not a person with her own name on diplomas, awards, and student thank you notes pinned to my classroom wall. I had shrunk so gently over the years, I hadn't even noticed. But tonight changed that. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I remembered what it felt like to move from the margins back into my own story. He finally spoke when we pulled into the driveway. "You could have told me." I looked at him and said nothing. Because what do you tell someone who never asked? What do you say to a man who introduced you like an afterthought and now wants front row access to a moment he never earned? I walked inside and left the door open behind me, just enough to see if he'd followed. He didn't. He sat in the car for a few minutes longer, as if debating whether to come in as a partner or remain outside as a spectator. I went upstairs, changed out of the gown, and placed the heels I had worn into a donation box near the closet. They were beautiful, but I had outgrown the woman who wore them to be admired, not heard. In the mirror, I studied my face without makeup, my hair slightly undone, and something in my reflection felt different. Not prettier. Not colder. Just returned. Like I had finally reclaimed a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. Downstairs, I heard the door open and close. He entered quietly, like someone stepping into a room they no longer feel entitled to. I didn't say anything. I wanted to see what he would do with the silence. Would he fill it with defensiveness? Would he ask questions that mattered? Or would he pretend nothing had shifted at all? He walked into the living room, paused, and looked around like he was trying to remember where he fit. I was curled up on the couch with a book, a novel about a woman who left everything behind to find herself. He asked, "Are we really going to act like that didn't happen?" I turned a page and replied, "No. I'm acting like it finally did." Because sometimes, the loudest moment in a relationship isn't the argument, it's the clarity that arrives after you stop explaining yourself. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at me like he was trying to figure out who I had become. But the truth is, I hadn't become anything new. I had simply stopped hiding. He lowered himself into the armchair across from me, hands clasped between his knees, his voice quieter than usual. "You embarrassed me," he said. "Not you surprised me, or I didn't know you were planning that, but you embarrassed me." And with that, the final thread between us snapped. Because that sentence wasn't about hurt. It was about control. I closed the book gently and met his eyes. "I didn't do it for you," I said. "And I didn't do it to you." He blinked, confused. "Then why?" I took a breath and answered simply, "Because my value doesn't need your permission to exist." The room went still, and for the first time, he looked small, not in stature, but in understanding. He had built his pride on being the powerful one, the provider, the person everyone respected. But tonight, I had shifted the dynamic without raising my voice, without storming out, without asking for permission. I stood and walked past him, leaving the book open on the coffee table, a bookmark tucked neatly between two pages titled "The moment she stopped explaining. That night, I slept better than I had in years, not because things were resolved, but because something finally was. The performance was over, and I had taken back the script. When I walked through the front door, the house looked exactly the same. The shoes by the door, the framed photos on the wall, even the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in the hallway. But something was different, and it wasn't the space. It was me. I moved through each room not like a visitor or a wife returning to her duties, but like someone reclaiming her coordinates. I wasn't checking for signs of his mood or scanning for what version of him I'd meet. I was simply home with myself. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his eyes tired, unsure. "You're back," he said, as if he hadn't known whether I would return. I nodded. "I came back to close the door," I said quietly. "Not to slam it. Not to make a scene. Just to close it from my side." He asked if we could talk. And we did. For the first time, it wasn't a debate or an emotional tug-of-war. I told him what I had swallowed. What I had dimmed. What I had finally named. He didn't fight it. Maybe because he knew. Maybe because he'd felt the shift before I said a word. I wasn't there to punish him. I was there to draw the line where I had once erased myself. And when I said, "I wish you well," I meant it. But I also meant this: I no longer needed to be small to be loved. And I would never again trade visibility for belonging. We didn't cry. We didn't argue. We didn't rush into a decision about what would happen next. But something unspoken passed between us, like the quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had ended, even if we hadn't reached for the bookmark at the same time. I packed a few more things that evening. Not in anger. Just in truth. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic exits. Only the sound of drawers opening, of a suitcase zipping, and of a woman who had finally chosen to stop waiting for someone else to make room for her life. Before I left, I paused at the front door. I looked back not to mourn, but to honor. Because I had loved him, truly. I had believed in what we were building. But somewhere along the way, the blueprint had started to require parts of me I could no longer sacrifice. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, not stopping me, not pleading. And I realized, with a soft kind of ache, that maybe he had always loved the version of me who needed his permission to shine. And that version was gone. I walked out into the evening air, and it didn't feel like escape, it felt like arrival. Like stepping into a life where I didn't need validation to feel valuable. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but I knew I wasn't lost. I was just, finally not shrinking. And that, to me, was more than freedom. It was self-respect made visible. About a few weeks later, I was invited to another gala, this time as the keynote speaker for an educational fund I had quietly helped establish years before. I almost said no. The thought of returning to the same space where I had once been introduced as just a teacher made my stomach twist. But something inside me whispered, this time, go for you. So I went. Alone. In a simple dress I loved, not one chosen to impress or to fit beside someone else's image. When I arrived, I was greeted with warmth, respect, and a name tag. That didn't need correction. As I stood on the stage that evening, speaking to a crowd who had no idea what I had walked through to stand there, I felt no need for revenge or recognition. I didn't look around for his face. I wasn't hoping he'd hear about it or regret anything. I was simply rooted in a truth I had earned, that the most powerful transformations often happen in silence, in private, in the space between heartbreak and healing. And when the applause came, I didn't bow, I breathed. Because this wasn't about proving anything. This was about presence. About becoming. And as I stepped off the stage, a young girl waiting near the exit looked up at me and said, "I want to be like you someday." I smiled. "No," I said gently. "Be like you. But never let anyone make you feel small for it." Then I walked into the night, whole. I booked a quiet cabin 2 hours from the city, no luxury, no distractions, just silence and soft light through tall windows. It was the kind of place where the phone signal faded and thoughts got louder, where you could hear your own breath. And remember it was yours. I arrived late in the afternoon, set down my bag, and stood in the center of the empty room, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of wood and wind. There was something sacred in the solitude. Not lonely. Sacred. That night, I made tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat on the floor with a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The first page stared at me blankly, but instead of feeling pressure, I felt possibility. I began writing, not about him, not about us, but about me. My dreams. My fears. My voice, uncensored and uninterrupted. And as the words filled the page, I realized how long it had been since I had asked myself what I wanted without considering how it would affect someone else's comfort. I wrote until the candle beside me melted halfway down. In that room, with no eyes on me, no expectations to meet, no titles to uphold, I began to exist again, not as a wife, not as a guest in someone else's life, but as the author of my own becoming. And for the first time in years, I slept without waiting for an apology. Because the closure I needed wasn't his, it was mine to write. The next morning, I woke to birdsong instead of alarms, and the kind of silence that didn't press on your chest, it expanded it. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the ritual, and stepped outside barefoot, letting the cold deck boards remind me I was fully present. There was no one to perform for here. No one to explain myself to. Just the wind, the trees, and the version of me I had long postponed. I thought about how often I had chosen harmony over honesty, believing it made me strong to keep the peace. But peace built on erasure is just quiet decay. And I had lived enough years dissolving quietly in the name of love. So I sat and made a second list, this time, not of what I had given up, but of what I wanted to reclaim. My curiosity. My laughter. The way I used to sing in the car with the windows down. The thrill of making decisions without second guessing. I didn't know what would happen when I went back, not with him, not with us. But I knew this, I would never again allow someone's inability to see me become the reason I disappeared. I would never again mistake dismissal for misunderstanding. Because now, I had remembered what my presence felt like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's lens. I wasn't just healing, I was choosing. And for the first time, the choice was entirely mine. By the third day, I stopped checking my phone. Not out of defiance, but because I had nothing to prove. I didn't need to know whether he had texted or called. I wasn't waiting for guilt, or grand gestures, or even understanding. I had let go of the hope that he would wake up one day and finally speak my name with the weight it deserved. That burden wasn't mine anymore. On the final morning, I packed my things without hesitation. But before leaving, I wrote myself a letter. Not a journal entry. Not a to-do list. A letter, from me to me. I promised to never again abandon myself. To be loved by someone else. I promised to protect my own joy like I used to protect his ego. I folded it carefully, tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, and whispered, "Don't forget this time." As I drove back toward the city, toward whatever came next, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't trying to script the next scene. I simply knew I was no longer a background character in my own life. If he was waiting at home, I'd speak calmly. If he wasn't, I'd still walk in with peace. Because the real shift had already happened. I had stepped out of a role I was never meant to play. And in doing so, I had written an ending that didn't need his signature to be valid. Some closures don't come in conversations. They come in quiet decisions no one sees. In the days that followed, I didn't bring it up again. Not the gala. Not the name on the donation plaque. Not the way he shifted around me like a man walking on cracked ice. I went to work like always, taught my students about perspective and integrity, two things I now understood even more deeply. In the classroom, I felt grounded, clear, alive. My students didn't care what I wore to fundraisers or whose arm I arrived on. They cared that I saw them, that I listened, that I reminded them their voices mattered even when the world tried to tune them out. At lunch, I sat under the old oak tree behind the school with my journal and a thermos of tea, writing not about revenge or regret, but about reclamation. I began to make a list of all the ways I had made myself small, the jokes I laughed at but didn't find funny, the introductions I allowed without correction, the achievements I downplayed so he could feel taller. And as the list grew, something inside me quieted, not out of sadness, but release. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done carrying the weight of someone else's comfort over my own truth. At night, we shared the same house but not the same space. Conversations were shallow, smiles mechanical. I noticed how he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to shrink back down. But I had learned something in that spotlight. Once you taste the full flavor of your worth, you can't pretend bland is enough. He started trying harder after that. Bought flowers he used to forget. Asked about my day, but with a tone that felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he found too late. I watched him try to reverse a shift he didn't fully understand, thinking gestures could replace presence, that charm could undo absence. But there was no malice in me. I wasn't looking to punish him. I was simply no longer available for a version of love that required my disappearance. I had begun to build things in quiet corners of my life. Reconnected with old friends. Applied to a writing workshop I once put off because it didn't fit our schedule. I even revisited my maiden name in ways that felt more than symbolic. It felt like reintroducing myself to the world on my own terms. Meanwhile, he seemed confused by my calm. He didn't know how to respond to a woman who no longer argued, but also no longer bent. One night, he asked if I was still angry. I looked at him and said, "I'm not angry. I'm aligned." He didn't understand what that meant, and I didn't try to explain. Because the truth is, when someone has only ever known you by the version of yourself that served their narrative, your growth will always look like distance. He hadn't lost me at the gala. He had already begun losing me long before. Each time he mistook silence for agreement and compliance for love. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the framed photo we took at our engagement party. He was smiling wide, hand resting on my waist, while I leaned in just slightly, as if unconsciously trying to be smaller in the picture. I stared at it for a while, remembering how I used to think love meant being chosen. How I had once accepted crumbs of visibility in exchange for the illusion of partnership. But I didn't feel sorrow looking at that photo now. I felt clarity. A strange sort of peace that arrives when you stop trying to edit your truth to make others more comfortable. That night, I packed a small suitcase, not as an ultimatum, but as an affirmation. I needed space. Not for drama, not to make a statement, but to hear myself think without his shadow over every thought. When I told him I was leaving for a few days, he asked, "Is this about the gala again?" And I realized then that he still didn't see it. He was still trying to trace the fracture to a single event, as if the weight of his disregard hadn't been accumulating in quiet moments for years. "It's about the silence that followed," I said. "And all the times I mistook it for peace." I didn't wait for his reply. I simply grabbed my keys and stepped into the night. The air outside felt like breath, fresh, full, and mine. I was no longer running from him. I was finally walking toward myself.